In New York City, we see an incredibly stratified educational system that's segregated by lines of race and class, reflecting in a lot of ways the same structure as the global city overall. And that gap is maintained through intense policing and also the work to break young people's spirits in a lot of ways. Right? But that's not a gap that communities are just sitting back and letting exist. Right? We started to hear how that's being challenged from below.
Unfortunately, there's nothing more universal than policing that protects the interests of the ruling class in the state. In order to carry out and create the global city, there's a reliance on policing of bodies. And in this case, it's primarily students in schools is what I'm going to be focusing on. So I wanted to talk about how are students allowed to exist in schools and around the building's facilities? Where can they be? What can they do? What can they say? How can they speak? How they're allowed to behave? Their bodies are policed. And why is this done? Although it's under the cover of creating safe environments, it's the students themselves that are least safe. And I'm not speaking about every school or every student, although the themes can be seen to different degrees in various places, but I'm more speaking about low-income communities of color, where at some schools, Hope units are based inside of a school, where metal detectors are suspected, incidents of students being arrested is commonplace. Sorry, I'll slow down, sorry. This is being done not to create more critical thinkers for the world, but to control students, to control goods. With an increased emphasis placed on tests from the No Child Left Behind Act, this serves to force teachers to teach the tests, students to learn to them, and serves corporate agendas of creating obedient workers that in the future can carry out menial tasks and not become problems or unionize or question authority. This idea of making profit off students can't be separated from corporate interests and investments in maintaining and expanding the prison industrial complex, which Edwin spoke about. It's a concept, this concept of school to prison pipeline is useful in looking at this. And groups like NICOR and the NYCLU Prison Moratorium Project, Teachers Unite, National Economic and Social Rights Initiative have written reports about all of this. As I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, the way now more than ever, students, since 2000, the incidence of students being suspended each year has more than doubled, which is millions of students every year. Once students are suspended, they're more likely to be held back, drop out, commit crime, or end up incarcerated as an adult and become part of the prison system. The incidents of increased suspension are connected to a citywide increase of policing in schools and seen in the reliance of zero-tolerance policies, increased school safety officers, and NYPD in schools, where the number of school safety agents in the New York public school system is more than a lot of cities around the country have cost to citizens. So that's like more than 5,000 school safety agents. What is this control about? Why are we afraid of students? Why are we afraid of our children? The desire for control is not just seen with the presence of officers in school, but with particular climates and modes of behavior that is encouraged in many schools. Also about kind of what Edwin was speaking about, for example, the KIPP model of schools, which is a charter model of schools, where children all dress the same, they perform amazing on tests, have good behavior, the standards of control, and it's students of color in low-income areas. So we see all these kids who are looking and dressing the same and wondering what kind of visions of success that we are placing on these kids, that we want them to achieve, and what kind of New York City are we wanting them to enter. So imagining a more just world, we have to listen to students and what they're saying and what they want. We need to encourage critical thinking, support student actions, and students of, like the Urban Youth Collaborative, which is a coalition of students from all over the city. We need to support teachers that are organizing to support their students, like NICOR and Teachers Unite, as we all struggle for social justice in and outside our classrooms.
thing. I think we need to think about the history of charter schools in general, because I think in many ways, or I guess there's two things going on here. There's the small schools movement, which I think has had a long history in the city in particular. If we look at, the Central Park East and all of the West Side High School and the smaller schools that came in the 60s and 70s, or in the 70s and into the 80s. I think we also need to think about, I think there was a move, even within the charter school movement, of a progressive move towards how do we create freedom in terms of intellectual, professional freedom for teachers, and create small communities in order to meet the needs of children in intimate ways that comprehensive, large high schools weren't meeting. I think that's part of the history, as much as the other part that I think we hear about more, which is, I think, become the dominant message here, which is, having, one thing I didn't talk about was the way neoliberalism is kind of, it masks and kind of co-opts terms and ideas like choice, this idea of choice, or the idea of diversity, or smallness, or, because I think in some ways charter schools might argue that they've, reduced and allowed for more community control, because it's reduced size and it's made things smaller. But in doing that, what it's done, and I think I see similar things in the small school movement in terms of the way it was taken over in the mayoral. Once we shift into mayoral control, small schools becomes this major project of the current mayoral administration, kind of almost negating its history here in New York. And so what we see in those two things that I feel is that you have you created choice, and you've created these empowerment schools or schools of autonomy, but in doing that, the power structure didn't let go of its power. It just kind of created this mask of power where resources are now in the hands of principals to make decisions on the ground, but it didn't really allow for any community voice. And I think at the same time, what it did was it allowed, as you were saying, this kind of creaming of students, into these smaller environments in a way that that left the majority of the students who were in the comprehensive school system with very little access to certain things if you were low income or if you were a person of color, and didn't have certain kind of currency or capital in which to access things. So I feel as though, that's what I feel like charter schools have been, a privatized model that has really started to grow everywhere, and in many ways people see it as this, salvation of freedom and choice, but it's very particular to this kind of corporate kind of structure in terms of schooling and what which kids can go and cannot go. I think I'll finish here. I think one of the most, or the two populations that I see most affected by this are English language learners and the students with disabilities, because they, because charter schools, depending on their charter, still have certain test scores and certain performance things to meet. They don't also, at the same time, they don't have the financial resources to be inclusive in that way unless the charter school makes that decision. But in this kind of privatized model, they have the freedom to kind of ignore and marginalize those communities. And the reality is that a lot of those children are children of color, and they're the ones that oftentimes end up in the prison system. And so it's interesting to see that these communities again get marginalized.